So last year in April, I actually took a trip to New Orleans among several other places in the American South. And I thought I should talk about it a bit because it is a very interesting place. I would say New Orleans, if I had to sum it up, it's a very beautiful city, but it's also, in a way, a very tragic city. Um, in many ways, it's one of the best places in the United States, and in some ways, it's one of the worst. And I really think it's such a complicated city that it is fascinating. Like frankly, there's nowhere else really like it in the United States, or for that matter, really anywhere in the world. But it's somewhere that's very unique, and I think it's somewhere that's everybody should experience at least once because it's just not quite like anywhere else. So, what makes New Orleans very unique is the fact that it has a heritage that is like it was ruled over at different points by the French, by the Spanish, and by the United States. And you can really see that influence. To my understanding, most of the architecture that was built today was actually built by the Spanish. Like in the French Quarter, like it's actually a misnomer that it's called the French Quarter because it was actually built by Spaniards, to my understanding. Now I could be wrong there, but that's my impression because I think New Orleans it had a great fire in the late 1700s, and most of the architecture today in the French Quarter is from just after then, like early 1800s, and was built under the Spanish. Now, were there Anglo Americans who also played a part in building all of it? Perhaps. It's a bit murky. Like honestly, I've tried to find out like who really built what we have in New Orleans today, like the historic buildings. It's hard to like find exactly who it was. Like there's definitely Spanish, French, and Anglo-American influences, but who actually built it, I'm not entirely sure. Like talking specifically about the French Quarter. Like I've heard French Quarter is a misnomer and that it's actually the Spanish more so, but I'm not entirely sure on that one. But yeah, the regardless, the type of architecture, it's very unique. Like if I had to compare it to anywhere else, I would actually say the place that has the most similar architecture is Nice in France. Like there's actually some buildings, like a few buildings in Nice, not too many, but there's a few that look very, very similar to the buildings in New Orleans. And I'm not sure which came first, but it's just interesting to see that parallel. I would say Nice has a similar vibe to New Orleans overall, but I think New Orleans is a bit grittier. And that's sort of I think what makes the city unique is like it has a very Mediterranean vibe, very like Southern European vibe in kind of a gritty way, sort of similar to like I mean, as I said, Nice, I think it resembles the most aesthetically, like architecturally, but in terms of the gritty vibe, I'd say it's more reminiscent of, say, Genoa or Naples or maybe Barcelona or Lisbon or Porto, perhaps. Um, Now it's not quite as large as those as some of those cities, like, and it also the buildings aren't quite as tall. Like the historic buildings in the French Quarter are mostly like one or two stories. Some of them might be three or four, a few of them, but you don't have like really tall historic buildings like that are like five or six stories in the same way as you would in say Naples or Genoa. But nonetheless, I mean, it's still it's a very interesting city. Like it has a feeling that nowhere else really in the United States or Canada has. Interestingly, like I've heard pickpocketing is an issue there, which is kind of another way in which it's kind of like Europe because pickpocketing is more of a thing in Europe than in the United States. So I guess it is kind of an issue that comes with the territory of having a European style walkable city, I guess, as pickpocketing becomes more of a problem. But is what it is, I guess. And that leads me to, yeah, the thing about New Orleans, like as I've said, that what's great about New Orleans is the architecture, the food. There's a lot of great food there, like dessert food, but also like main course food. There's types of foods that are like unique to New Orleans, but then there's other types that are more like broadly southern. And it's like if you want either of those types of cuisine, New Orleans is great for them. So those are like the positives. The food and the architecture, and now the weather is a mixed bag. Honestly, I had good weather when I was there, but it can vary. Like I know it can be rainy almost any time of the year there. So there's that, and also of course, obviously there's the potential for hurricanes in the summer and the fall, which is why I went in the spring, which is probably the best time to go. Like if you're going to go there, I would say either March, April, or May are probably the best months. February only if you want to deal with the whole Mardi Gras thing. Like that could be a pro or a con if that's what you're into. But yeah, if you're not into that whole Mardi Gras scene, I'd recommend probably sometime between March and May would be your best bet. But yeah, if you're a lover of historic architecture like I am, like New Orleans is a very unique place. Like it has very distinct forms of architecture, like these, I guess you'd call them wrought iron balconies that kind of wrap all the way around the buildings. They're very unique to New Orleans. Like it's not something you'll find too much anywhere else on earth. As I said, I found a few buildings like that in Nice, France, and there's a few also in like Savannah, Georgia, Charleston, South Carolina, but by and large, it's you'll find much more of that in New Orleans than anywhere else. It's just a lot of very colorful architecture, not just in the French Quarter, but other areas too. Like the Lower Garden District is really nice. Also Marigny, I think it's pronounced. It's an area kind of east of the French Quarter. Treme, which is immediately north of the French Quarter. So yeah, there's a lot of nice areas to kind of Bywater, which is east of Marigny. Areas to sort of walk around in. I would say the French Quarter is the best though. And my second favorite area was actually the Lower Garden District, which I think is a very underrated area. Particularly, there's a park there. I forget what it's called, but it's a really nice park. It's near the Prytania Hotel. That's where I stayed. That was a really great hotel, but it is closed now, I think, and they don't tell you on the website. A lot of people are pissed about that. But yeah, very beautiful park near there. So yeah, underrated area for sure, the Upper Garden District. Although it is an area you need to be a bit wary in because it's a little bit sketchy, which is something I'm going to get into. I'm going to get into the cons of New Orleans shortly, but yeah, pros like architecture, food. Again, with food, like the New Orleans specific food is kind of like a lot of different seafood dishes mostly. Whereas there's also the more like broadly southern cuisine you can have there too, like fried chicken, chicken sandwiches, barbecue meat, etc. Mac and cheese, like so it's like really there's the combination of both those different types of cuisines. You can't really go wrong with either. Oh, fried oysters are fucking amazing. If you've never had fried oysters, definitely something good to have. I didn't have them in New Orleans. I actually had them in Atlanta at like a really like kind of like ghetto place, but it was really good. It was like a ghetto place that was run by like an East Asian woman in the hood. So yeah. But that was really good too. So fried oysters would be something to try out. And just yeah, like the food is really delicious there. I mean, obviously it's not the healthiest food. I mean, it's America. What do you expect? But really delicious. I guess that's most of the pros of New Orleans. Now, what are the cons? Well, the biggest con is the people telling you that they know where you got your shoes. Do not fall for that one. Just don't. Like if you fall for that one, you are stupid. It's like the oldest scam in the books. Like basically they go up to you and they say, "I can tell you where you got your shoes." And the answer is that you got them on your feet. You got them on your feet. You got them on the street. You got them on the town. You got them on the ground, motherfucker. Like that's basically the answer to where you got your shoes. Like, I can tell you where you got your shoes, your money's what you got to lose, motherfucker. So yeah, do not fall for that whole thing. Just don't. You'd have to be really dumb to fall for it. And I saw some people actually fall for it, Like, oh, I bet you can't guess where I bought them. I bought them at Zellers in Canada back when Zellers used to exist. Oh, I bet you can't guess that. Yeah, yeah, they're not gonna try to guess that. Just don't fall for it. But yeah, I mean, there's also like a lot of, for some reason, like Buddhists trying to scam you by giving you prayer beads and then making you pay for it. It's like, which is weird because New Orleans it's associated with beads, but it's like it's not that type of beads. It's like a type you wear around your neck, but they give you these like Buddhist prayer beads for some reason, I guess to confuse people who think that's like what New Orleans is associated with, but then they try to make you pay for it. So it's like I didn't know Buddhists were into like scamming people, but apparently in New Orleans they are. It's really bizarre because the city doesn't have a large Asian population otherwise, but for some reason there's all these people dressed as Buddhist monks trying to scam you by aggressively giving you prayer beads and then making you pay for them. It's really, really weird. And I've only ever seen this in New Orleans. It's bizarre. So yeah, do not fall for the I can tell you where you got your shoes or oh I can spell your last name and then they say Yourlastname. It's so stupid. Just don't fall for that shit. If anybody, some random guy, usually black guy, comes up to you trying to engage you in conversation and it goes in this direction, just say no thanks, goodbye. Like the guy who came up to me, he first tried to talk to me about how he's a rapper and how he's allegedly rapped alongside Lil Wayne before, which I mean, press X to doubt on that one, but I mean, regardless, it's like he started with that and then he got right into like, "Yo, I like your shoes. I bet I can tell you where you got them." And then at that point I'm just like, "Nah, I'm cool, bro." Like no thanks. Like just no. Just say no if anybody tries to scam you with that shit. So then yeah, that's the most obvious thing. But the thing is, New Orleans, it is kind of crime ridden in general. Like, I mean, much worse things can happen to you than the guy saying, I can tell you where you got your shoes, and then him following you around until you give him $10. Like, I mean, people do get mugged in New Orleans all the time. People get murdered. It has one of the highest murder rates in the US. I mean, most of the victims are not tourists or random people, but it does happen from time to time. Like there was a tourist murdered in New Orleans a few weeks ago, in actually not an area of the city that's not considered a bad part of the city. Although to be fair, it was at 1:30 a.m. And it's like, honestly, I did not go outside in New Orleans after dark at all. So yeah, I get it for a lot of people. That's part of the experience, like being on Bourbon Street after dark where the party is. But it's like, I didn't fuck around with that shit. I was in the hotel by sundown. So it's like, again, if you're going out at night, you're inherently taking more of a risk. So yeah, I mean, do what you will in that regard, but that's my advice. I would say just treat New Orleans as a sundown town, like when the sun is down, just be in your hotel or hostel or wherever you're staying. That would be my advice. Another thing that's not so great is unfortunately in recent years they decided for whatever reason they would no longer allow tourists to go inside the historic cemeteries. Now, the cemetery that is widely seen as the most beautiful, I think it's like Lafayette. Is it number 1 or number 2? It's in the Garden District. I did get somewhat of a look at it because you can walk around the perimeter and you can see through the gates. And by looking in through the gates, you can see a good deal of the cemetery because it's not that big. It's very beautiful, but again, it would have been nice to go inside. Like they used to let you go in these cemeteries and guided tours. For whatever reason, they discontinued it, allegedly due to COVID. Like so many fucking things, be it public bathrooms, be it so many things that they said like, oh, we're just temporarily discontinuing it due to COVID. But then it's like, oh, now that the alleged pandemic is over, oh, we're still gonna keep these things closed for some reason. Shit, I should not have said the C word. Now this video is probably going to be taken down. Oh well. Um, but anyway, yeah. So that is one thing that is a bit disappointing, that you can't go inside the cemeteries anymore. It would have been nice to. I mean, at least I got to see the one through the gates from the outside, which is probably the most beautiful of all the cemeteries. But it would have been nice to go inside, and the other ones too. Like, I get why they don't just randomly let people go in, because it's like people do vandalize it, but I don't see why they couldn't let people go in supervised guided tours. Like, were people somehow like getting away from the tour group and vandalizing it? I don't know. Like, could they not, like, I don't know, have the tour is more heavily guarded, even if it means the tour being a bit more expensive? I don't know. It just kind of sucks that you can't do that anymore. The other thing is, like, I mean, yeah, as far as crime goes, I would say, like, the best strategy is A, don't go out at night, and B, stick to certain parts of the city. Like, I would say the general rule of thumb is that the closer you are to the river, the safer it is, and the further you go away from the river, the more dodgy it gets. Like, there's a certain street, I think it's like Rampart. Oh wait, it was Rampart Street. Yeah, I think Rampart Street is the northern end of the French Quarter. Generally, I would say that street, don't go north of it. Although I went in a little bit in the neighborhood of Tremé, which is like right north of the east end of the French Quarter. Nothing happened to me there, but I did get kind of sketchy vibes. Like, nothing happened to me anywhere on this trip. Like, I did not get mugged or anything. I saw numerous people who looked sketchy though, and who, like, I felt like they could have mugged me if they wanted to, and maybe they were considering it, but nothing happened to me. And to be honest, like of the guys who gave me sketchy vibes, I'd say about like 85% were probably black, which is higher than the percentage of blacks in the city of New Orleans and the metropolitan area. But to be fair, there was a few white guys who gave me sketchy vibes too. It was a number higher than zero, I will say that. Like, there were a few sketchy white people too. But yeah, the vast majority of people who gave me sketchy vibes were black men. And it was not like gangs, it was usually like individuals. That's the thing. Even crime is becoming more atomized in society these days. Like, I don't know if it's a New Orleans thing or just the fact that, like, ever since, 2020, everyone's become so atomized that even criminals are more atomized these days, operating more, as individuals rather than in gangs. But who knows? Because I remember growing up, like, in the 2000s and earlier, like in the 2010s, there were a lot more, like, gangs, like guys who just look like they were in gangs. Whereas nowadays, in the last few years, it seems like not just in New Orleans, but in general, like, the majority of sketchy looking people are like these, like, individuals, the rugged individual lone wolves, the mangy omega wolves, kind of, walking around by themselves without the wolf pack, looking hungry for someone to eat. So yeah, I don't know if that's like a specifically New Orleans thing or just indicative of a larger societal trend. But yeah, it wasn't so much like groups of sketchy guys, but rather lone individuals who looked very haggard and just untrustworthy. Now, that being said, that was during the day. I have no idea what it's like after dark because I did not venture outside after dark. But yeah. And I think, okay, when I talk about the rule of thumb, in the western part of the city, like west of downtown, like in the Garden District, in the lower Garden District, it's St. Charles Street, which is where the streetcar goes. That's the street you probably don't want to go north of, generally speaking. Although, as you get further west toward Audubon Park, I think it might be fine north of there. But yeah, so it's Rampart Street to the east, and then St. Charles to the west. Those are the streets that basically run east-west, parallel to the river, that I would say generally don't go north of if you want to stay safe. I mean, I guess Tremé, immediately north of the French Quarter, on the east side, like north of the east side of the French Quarter, isn't the worst. But even there, it gets dodgy a bit west of there, because a bit west of there is the Iberville housing project, which is one of the worst in the city. That's near some of those cemeteries that you can't go in anymore. But yeah, that's a sketchy place. Avoid there. Iberville. Yeah. Now, yes, the sketchy parts of the city do have some good restaurants. I didn't go to those restaurants. I didn't go to those parts of the city. There's plenty of good restaurants in the less, like, there's not really a non-sketchy part of New Orleans. There's just less sketchy. I guess if there's a non-sketchy part, the least sketchy would definitely be the Garden District. Like, where I'm not talking about the lower, like, I personally think the lower Garden District is more beautiful in terms of architecture, but the main Garden District, um, is definitely the least sketchy part of the city. It's further west. Um, very it's sort of, it's a nice area. It's just it's lower density. Like, it's, I'd say it's in a density area that's kind of like a gray area between medium density and low density. It's almost at a suburban level density, but still significantly older than the suburbs. And it's not like ugly like the suburbs where the garages dominate the houses and I don't think most of these houses even have garages. But yeah, I mean, it's it's still pretty, but it's like it doesn't have as much of a city vibe as further east, so that's the thing. But that is where that one cemetery is. I think Lafayette number 1 or number 2, the most beautiful one, the one that you can still kind of see through the gates. Yeah, that's in the Garden District. So yeah, that's like the least sketchy part of the city. But yeah, I mean, I would say probably better to stick to the less sketchy parts. I mean, yes, there's a few really good restaurants. Allegedly, I didn't go to them, but there's some restaurants that are really good in the more sketchy parts too. But it's like, I don't know, is it worth it? Be your own judge on that. I mean, I went to some great restaurants in the less sketchy parts of the city, so yeah. And I mean, less sketchy, again, it's all in relative terms. New Orleans is inherently sketchy, but I would say the least bad parts are probably, as I said, the Garden District, the Upper Garden District. The Lower Garden District is beautiful, but it's in the medium sketchy category. And then in the French Quarter, I would say in the French Quarter, like Bourbon Street and south of Bourbon Street, it feels safer because there is a certain element of like safety in numbers because there's just so many tourists there. Whereas if you go north of Bourbon Street in the French Quarter, um, there's a bit less foot traffic, a bit fewer people on the streets, and it does feel a bit dodgier up there. Like, that's where I had the one guy come up to me and do the, I can tell you where you got your shoes thing. Nothing actually happened to me there, but I don't know. It's still fine though. I'd say, like, just as I said, like, the further north you go, the more sketchy it gets. The further away from the river you go, the more sketchy it gets, generally speaking. But yeah, I guess what makes New Orleans also fascinating, along with, I guess, Savannah, Georgia, and St. Augustine, Florida, Charleston, South Carolina, which I also went to on the same trip, is that these cities are like, their English is the dominant language, and the majority of the white people there are of, like, Northwestern European ancestry predominantly. Like, I think there's, like, in New Orleans, like, I think a lot of people do have, like, French ancestry to some extent, but they still, they speak English. Like, not many people in New Orleans still speak French. The only places I think where there's still a lot of people who speak French are in some of the rural areas of Louisiana, but even there, it's not the majority. It might be like 10% of the population speaks French as their main language, but all these people also speak English. So it's interesting that you have these cities where the architecture looks predominantly Southern European, but the people, at least the white people, predominantly look Northern European. Like, and also that they speak English. So it's kind of an interesting juxtaposition in that regard. The juxtaposition of, like, the Anglo elements, but also the Southern European elements. I'd imagine many places in the Caribbean had a similar vibe at one point back when there was a significant white population. Like, actually, that's where you know what New Orleans reminded me a bit of Tortuga from the Pirates of the Caribbean movies. It reminds me a bit of there, especially on Bourbon Street, which is really where the party atmosphere is. Like, even during the middle of the day, there's still a strong party atmosphere there. But I guess the tragic thing about New Orleans is it does feel like it's a city on borrowed time in many ways because of like the threat of hurricanes, the threat of flooding. Like, hopefully the levees will still hold up. Like it's just like, you know, Venice and Amsterdam. Like there's so many historic cities that are like threatened by this. Now, is the threat overstated? I don't know. Like, to be honest, as far as global warming goes, I find that like we're getting less of the catastrophic flooding that was predicted, but actually more of the forest fires than were predicted, and perhaps more extreme summer heat than predicted sooner. So it's like some aspects are happening sooner than predicted, some are happening less soon than predicted. So I don't know, maybe the catastrophic flooding hopefully won't happen soon. Hopefully it'll never happen. Hopefully we will find ways with the levees and whatever to protect this city, but I just don't know. Like, I would say it does feel like a city that exists kind of against nature. Like, it was probably not a good idea to build a city there, but it's like at the same time, it's like now that it is there, it is one of America's greatest historic treasures, maybe the greatest, like in terms of architecture of any city in the United States or Canada for that matter. And it's definitely like if you aren't like super afraid of crime, because it is a city where it's like crime is inherently a problem and you do have to watch out for it. But if you're not too afraid of that, where it's like you can kind of handle being in an area that's sort of sketchy, then I'd recommend going there. It's I had a great time. Also, I'd recommend going to Oak Alley Plantation nearby. That's really beautiful, historic plantation manor with the symmetrical oak trees on both sides. Very gorgeous. Also, John Lafayette Nature Preserve has some great boardwalk trails where you can see alligators. They seemed harmless. I went pretty close to them. They seemed harmless. I don't know. Could they have attacked me? I don't know. Like people were just walking by them like it was not a big deal. I don't know. But it was pretty cool. Like very beautiful natural scenery there. Although they for some reason it closes at 5 sharp, so you got to be out of there like on time. I think they'll like stop you from leaving the parking lot or something. Like they'll put up like a barricade. I guess you're trapped in the parking lot all night in your car. Um it's really the only way to get there is by car. So yeah. Um the city itself is fairly walkable. Like I only had the car on the very last day there. Um and that's because I went to the at the places I both just mentioned, the Oak Alley Plantation and John Lafitte Nature Preserve on those days, and needed to drive to those. Not really any other way to get there, but the other 3 days I was there, didn't have the rental car and just relied on the trolleys, and yeah, that was fine. Like the trolleys, they're slow, but they'll get you pretty much where you need to go if you're near the trolley line. So yeah. And I guess one good thing is that in regards to Hurricane Katrina, it did decimate the city a lot, but I'm pretty sure the most historic neighborhoods of the city weren't actually hit that bad. So like, as far as I could see, like the vast majority of the historic architecture in the neighborhoods I went to was still intact. And again, like the areas I went to were probably the best parts of the city in terms of a having art like a lot of historic architecture and b not being like super sketchy areas of the city. So yeah, I mean in that regard, like you don't have to worry that much about like, you know, was everything destroyed in Katrina. It's really not as bad as people think in that regard. And I guess okay, one thing that I did find a bit disappointing was that as with many cities in America, I find the local accent is disappearing a bit. Like I didn't encounter too many people who had a distinctive New Orleans accent. It was mostly either like a generic American accent or a generic Black American accent. If it does still exist, it's getting rarer. I think some of the tradespeople had it, but yeah. Overall, had a great time there. Highly recommend.